On the 5th of October, 1974, bombs went off in 2 pubs in Guildford, England. 7 people died. Dozens more were wounded. Within weeks, 4 young people had confessed. Jerry Conlon, Paul Hill, Patrick Armstrong, Carol Richardson, just 17 years old. They were sentenced to life in prison. Case closed. Except it wasn't. 15 years later, in 1989, all 4 convictions were quashed. The confessions had been coerced. Hours of pressure, sleep deprivation, threats against their families, until 4 innocent people said whatever it took to make it stop. The real bombers were never caught. Most people assume pressure works. Enough fear, enough exhaustion, enough pain, and eventually, the truth comes out. It shows up in interrogation scenes in 1,000 films. The suspect resists, and then finally, under enough weight, breaks. And what comes out is treated as the truth, simply because it was hard to extract. It's one of the most common beliefs about human psychology there is. It's also, according to decades of research, almost backwards. Let's find out what actually happens inside a person's mind under that kind of pressure, and why the country that produced one of history's worst interrogation scandals ended up building the method that replaced it. For most of the 20th century, the dominant interrogation approach, especially in the United States, was something called the Reed technique. Developed in the 1940s and 50s, it begins from an assumption: the suspect did it. The interrogator's job isn't to find out what happened. It's to get them to admit what the interrogator already believes happened. Denials are not accepted. They're treated as resistance to be worn down. Interrogators are trained to express total certainty, to introduce fabricated evidence, fingerprints that don't exist, witnesses who were never there, and to offer the suspect a way out. A smaller story. An accident, not a murder. Self-defense, not an attack. Researchers call this minimization, offering the suspect a face-saving version of events that feels almost survivable to admit to. Paired with the opposite, maximization, exaggerating the certainty of the evidence, the severity of the outcome if they don't cooperate, until the gap between the 2 options feels enormous. Confess to the smaller story, or face the much larger one. Psychologist Saul Kassin, one of the most cited researchers in this field, describes what happens next with a simple phrase: hopelessness. Once a person believes nothing they say will be believed, and the pressure will not stop, short-term thinking takes over. Confessing stops looking like admitting guilt. It starts looking like the only way to make the room stop closing in. In 1996, Kassin ran an experiment that made this almost impossible to argue with. Volunteers were told to type quickly on a keyboard and warned that hitting one specific key, the Alt key, would crash the computer and destroy the data. None of them ever touched it. The computer was rigged to crash regardless. In the baseline version, around a quarter of innocent participants signed a statement admitting they'd hit the forbidden key. Then Kassin added one thing: a fake witness in the room who claimed they'd seen it happen. The false confession rate jumped to 80%. 80% of people who had done absolutely nothing wrong, signing their name to something false because someone they had no reason to doubt told them it was true. In a faster-paced version of the same experiment, where participants were already unsure of what they'd done, the numbers went further still. Every single participant signed. Nearly 2/3 said they genuinely believed they were guilty. And roughly 1/3 started inventing specific details to explain how they'd done it, a memory built entirely from nothing in under an hour. If a fake witness and a rigged keyboard can do that in a research lab, it isn't hard to imagine what hours of accusation, isolation, and exhaustion can do in a real interrogation room. There's a reason fear makes people this suggestible. Under sustained stress, the body floods with cortisol and adrenaline, the same chemistry behind fight or flight. Activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for careful reasoning and weighing consequences, measurably decreases. Activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, increases. You are, quite literally, less able to think clearly about long-term consequences. At the exact moment someone is asking you to make the decision of your life, add exhaustion, hunger, hours without sleep, and the effect compounds. The brain isn't built to hold out indefinitely. against a determined, confident accuser while running on empty. It's built to find the nearest way to make the threat stop. That isn't a character flaw. It's basic neurobiology, and it applies to innocent people exactly as much as guilty ones. Arguably more, since an innocent person has no memory of the crime to anchor against the story being fed to them. But there's something even stranger than lying to make the pressure stop. Sometimes, people don't just say they did it. They come to believe they actually did. Psychologists call this an internalized false confession. A person genuinely losing confidence in their own memory until a confident stranger's version of events starts to feel more real than their own. In 2015, psychologist Julia Shaw ran a study that demonstrated exactly how far this can go. Over a few hours of gentle, repeated suggestion, innocent adult volunteers were led to believe they had committed a crime, as serious as assault with a weapon, as teenagers. Most of them didn't just agree. They generated full, rich, emotionally detailed memories of an event that never happened, described with the same confidence people use for things they actually remember. Shaw's conclusion was unsettling precisely because it wasn't about lying at all. It was about how easily memory itself can be rebuilt, around a story someone else is certain of. This isn't a hypothetical problem. The Innocence Project has tracked hundreds of cases where DNA evidence later proved someone's innocence beyond doubt. In roughly a quarter to a third of those cases, the wrongful conviction involved a false confession. Some of these people served 10 years. Some served 20 or more before a piece of biological evidence, collected decades earlier, finally contradicted the story they themselves had signed. People who did nothing, convicted, sometimes for decades, partly because a piece of evidence almost everyone assumes is unshakable, someone admitting it themselves turns out to be exactly the kind of evidence pressure and a fragile enough memory can manufacture from nothing at all. The shift away from this isn't just academic. In 2017, one of the largest interrogation training companies in the United States, Wicklander-Zulawski, publicly announced it would stop teaching Reed-style accusatorial methods entirely after decades of training police departments across the country. Its own leadership said plainly that the technique had become impossible to defend once the false confession data was laid out next to it. An entire industry, built for half a century around one assumption, quietly changing its mind. Here's where it gets interesting. The same country that produced the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6, 6 more innocent men, coerced into false confessions after the same 1974 bombing campaign, wrongly imprisoned for 16 years, and the Maguire 7, a family convicted alongside them on evidence that turned out to be worthless, looked at its own interrogation rooms and rebuilt them from the ground up. A royal commission was convened. Investigators, lawyers, and psychologists were asked the same blunt question. If confessions this confident could be this wrong, what exactly had gone wrong in the room where they were made? In 1992, England and Wales introduced a new framework, known by the acronym PEACE. Planning and preparation, engage and explain, account, closure, evaluation. Notice what's missing from that list. Confession isn't the goal anywhere in it. Information is. Under PEACE, interviewers aren't trained to assume guilt. They're trained to build rapport first. Genuine active listening, matching tone rather than escalating it, treating the person across the table as someone worth hearing out completely before a single fact is challenged. Only once that foundation exists do they ask open questions and then get out of the way. Tell me what happened from the beginning. Then silence, long enough to feel uncomfortable, giving the person room to actually think rather than simply react. This isn't just kindness for its own sake. It's built on real cognitive science. Psychologists Ronald Fisher and Edward Geiselman had already shown, years earlier, developing what they called the cognitive interview, that human memory retrieves best under specific conditions: calm, not fear, open recall, not yes or no questions, mentally returning to the context of the original event, the sounds, the room, the sequence of small details, rather than being interrogated about it from a stranger's blank room under a single bright light. Their method, tested originally with witnesses and victims, increased the amount of accurate detail recalled by as much as 30 or 40% compared to standard questioning, without increasing the number of incorrect details at all. Report-based interviewing essentially builds an entire interrogation strategy around this one fact. A frightened brain narrows. It defends. It reaches for the fastest exit available. True or not, a calm brain can actually search its own memory properly. Evidence under peace isn't slammed on the table at the start as a threat. It's introduced strategically, late, piece by piece, a method researchers now call the strategic use of evidence. An honest person's account tends to line up with the facts as they emerge. A dishonest one starts contradicting itself, because they don't know yet what the interviewer actually has. The lie reveals itself, instead of being argued into existence. Norway adopted a version of this in 2002, calling it creative, built around a principle that would have sounded strange to most interrogators a generation earlier. Suspects are innocent until proven otherwise, not the other way around. Independent studies of Norwegian interviewers trained in the method found they gathered significantly more relevant information, asked far fewer leading questions, and reported higher suspect cooperation compared with older confrontational styles. Australia followed. New Zealand, Canada's National Police Force, the RCMP, adopted it in 2015. By the early 2020s, versions of peace, or its direct descendants, were standard practice across large parts of the English-speaking world and beyond. In 2021, the United Nations published the Mendez Principles, recommending rapport-based, non-coercive interviewing as the global standard for investigations everywhere, not just as a regional experiment. Named after the UN's own special rapporteur on torture, who had spent years documenting exactly where in the justice process coercion happens most. Interrogation rooms, more often than almost anywhere else. Meanwhile, in 2014, a US Senate committee released a report, more than 6,000 pages long, on years of so-called enhanced interrogation, used in counterterrorism after 2001. Among its conclusions, the harshest methods used did not produce reliably useful intelligence, and in multiple cases, the information extracted was later found to be fabricated, invented by detainees specifically to end the treatment. In case after case, detainees told interrogators whatever seemed likely to end the treatment, true or invented, exactly the pattern Kassin's small experiment had predicted with a keyboard and a rigged computer, playing out at national scale, with consequences far beyond a signed piece of paper. In 2012, psychologist Christian Meissner and colleagues pulled together every high-quality study they could find comparing the two approaches directly, under laboratory conditions where the researchers actually knew, with certainty, who was guilty and who wasn't. The result was about as clean as social science ever gets. Accusatorial, Reed-style methods increased confessions overall, but that increase included both true confessions and false ones, in roughly equal measure. Information-gathering methods, the peace-style approach, preserved, and in some studies even increased, the rate of true confessions, while simultaneously reducing false ones. Same goal, opposite outcome, depending entirely on which version of human psychology the method was actually built around. So here's where all of this actually lands. Pressure doesn't reliably produce truth. It reliably produces an ending. Any ending. Whatever sentence makes the pressure stop fastest, regardless of whether it happened. And sometimes, as Julia Shaw's research showed, regardless of whether the person saying it even remembers it as false anymore. Calm, patient, rapport-based questioning isn't softer because it's kinder, although it is kinda. It's more effective because it works with how memory and stress actually function instead of against them. A frightened mind isn't a more honest mind. It's a mind looking for the fastest exit, and it will describe that exit in whatever words it thinks will open the door. The country that once produced one of the clearest examples of what coercion destroys didn't just apologize for it. It built, studied, tested, and exported the opposite, turning a national scandal into a template, now used by police forces, human rights bodies, and the United Nations itself. 4 young people lost 15 years of their lives to a confession that was never true, extracted by exactly the pressure most people still assume works. Somewhere, right now, an interviewer trained in that same old method is asking a leading question, certain they already know the answer, certain that enough pressure will eventually reveal it. mistaking the speed of a confession for the strength of the evidence behind it. And somewhere else, another interviewer is asking an open one and waiting, in silence, for whatever comes next to simply be true, trusting the quiet more than the pressure, because the evidence, decades of it now, says that's the version that actually works, and the version that actually protects the people sitting on both sides of that table.